Good afternoon, and thank you very, very much for coming, because I know this is not the most convenient time for you to come to this session, and it shows a great deal about your interest in the book, the authors, or at least the editors, those associated with it, and also in the subject. Now, listening to the CVs always makes me think that these are like obituaries, but I really must say that I'm extraordinarily happy and privileged to be with Supriya, the most distinguished and highly respected academic. Sajni, also greatly respected academic from Jadavpur University, and Sujaan, who has undoubtedly a very bright future in academic life. Now, I'd just like to start by perhaps asking a few questions to get the process underway. Now, Supriya, in the foreword of this book, you are described as providing insights and archival findings to the book. Now, for a layman like me, I'm afraid that doesn't mean too much, so I'd be very grateful if you could tell us what your actual input has been, because I know that you've mentored a huge number of scholars who are forever grateful to you.
Thank you very much, Chris, and my gratitude again to the Calcutta Literary Meet and to the members of this panel for inviting me here. I'd like to say that in this case, my mentor was Sajni Mukerji, because it was Sajni who directed my attention to the existence of this book, about which I did not know when I commenced my study of this period in Bengali literary and cultural history. I was at that time working on the Porichoy Circle, a circle of modernist writers and scholars and, beyond modernism, scientists, historians, cultural, artists and so on, working in and around Calcutta in the 1930s. And the name Porichoy is derived from the journal that they published, called Porichoy, published from the 1931 onwards, and founded by Sudhindranath Dotto and edited by Sudhin Dotto and Prabodh Bagchi. The friends and associates of those who edited this journal met regularly for sessions of what in Bengali is known as Adda at the house of Sudhin Dotto and occasionally at Prabodh Bagchi's house during the 1930s. And Humphry House, then teaching at the Calcutta University, that is to say first at Presidency College and then at Ripon College, which later is called, has been renamed Surendranath College, was a member of the Porichoy Circle, and I became interested in the fact that this circle had connections with disaffected Englishmen in Calcutta at the time. So not just House, but also John Auden and Michael Carrett and Michael Scott. So I became more and more interested as I investigated the nature of the circle. I've written about it, and I'm still very grateful to Sajni for directing my attention to this book, which was published. It's not unpublished. It was published then in Calcutta, but is now seeing the light of day again in a new edition.
Well, that takes us very neatly to Sajni. Sajni, thank you very much for what you've done here in this book. You and Sujaan have edited it and annotated it with enormous care. I don't think I've ever seen more endnotes for a fairly short article than you have here. In fact, 59 altogether, which is really quite remarkable. So you've really eviscerated the text, I must say. But tell me, how did you actually arrive at this author who, with the best of intentions, is not really all that familiar?
He's very familiar to me. Because I did my PhD on Dickens, and
It's not working.
It's okay. I think you just have to hold it a bit closer.
Okay. I did my PhD on Dickens, and even before that, as an undergraduate, I was a student of Professor Amol Bhattacharjee, who was a great admirer and former student of Humphry House. And he had said to me, House is the best author on Dickens. And I must say, over time, I believed and became a devotee of House. So around 2012, which was Dickens's bicentenary, Jadavpur asked me back out of retirement to help organize a conference on Dickens. And fed up by now of writing on Dickens himself, I thought I'd write instead on Humphry House. And I went to National Library to look for whatever he had written. And I was quite familiar with most of the English stuff that he had written. I did know that I did also know that he had been in Calcutta for a while, and this was what I had heard from his wife Rajeshwari Dotto when I met her in Cambridge many years ago. And I was just suddenly absolutely overwhelmed, because one of the entries in the National Library was I Spy with My Little Eye. And I remember reading it with this tremendous sense of excitement and laughter. And yeah, Sujaan and I have annotated it very carefully. We've joked about the fact that our annotations in introduction are much larger than Humphry House's neat 26 pages. But we thought it was such a wonderful text that we did annotate every little thing that we came across. And we still might. We discovered one or two after the book was actually printed that we might have annotated. So I'm sorry if the annotations bored you, Krish, but...
On the contrary, it was really quite enlightening to see what you had not annotated. And I also discovered 2 references. So I'd be happy to exchange those with you. Please. But anyway, thank you very much. Sujaan, tell me, you know that Sajni's mentioned Dickens, but forgive my ignorance, but I think he became known for Dickens rather later, and then when he was in Calcutta, I think he might have been known for Hopkins, but not for Dickens, and certainly not for Coleridge, which also was later, which are his landmark activities really in literature. But tell me, what do you think really qualifies House to be a commentator on Calcutta of the period of 1936 to 1938?
Well, he wrote this through the latter half of 1937. So he starts writing sometime around July, August, I think, and finishes, those are the first references that we find, and he finishes writing it. It's out in October 1937. And he came to Kolkata in 1936, early 1936. So it's only 1.5 years of the city that he has seen. But I think what sets Humphry apart from a lot of people at the time who are coming to Kolkata and sort of living in a British or an English bubble, so to speak, is the fact that he is, well, it would appear almost a manic socializer. He's got his, he's at the center, or at least at the peripheries of several groups of friends who are both Indian, among Indians, as well as Supriya mentioned, people like Michael Carrett, John Auden, Michael Scott, and so on. And so I think he has a certain kind of perspective on the city which is quite rare. And I don't know if he has, if I would say that he has authority to speak on the city in a certain sense of, I mean, of knowing the city very well or something of that sort. But I mean, what I find attractive about it is that it offers a kind of a fresh and a cheeky take on the city, which I think is quite refreshing. So whether or not he has the right to speak on it, or whether, I mean, I find this part more interesting. I mean, what he does with it more interesting than where he's coming from. So that's, I think.
Thank you. Supriya, you mentioned Presidency College and Ripon College when you were speaking. I'd like to ask you, why did he leave Presidency after 1 year, and why did he leave Ripon after 1 year? What was do we know why his departure was, so to say, expedited?
I think that he left Presidency College because he fell out with the authorities. It seems to be fairly clear from his letters, from his, from what he writes, that after all, Presidency College was very much a seat of governmentality, if you see what I mean. Still is. I mean, well, not in the same way because it's now a university. But when I worked there, I was officially a Class 1 government servant. Sajni too has worked in that service. So I think that he probably left Presidency College because he found government service a little hard to take. And he moved to a private college. At that time, it would have been regarded as a government-sponsored but private college, Ripon College, because he found perhaps that the atmosphere is a little more free, a little more conducive to his particular kind of irreverence about authority. Because he was, in fact, from all his writings, it appears very irreverent in his attitude towards colonial power, towards colonial bureaucracy. The book itself, this book that we are discussing today, is full of asides against, what he regards as a police state. And indeed, it's kind of satire of the police state. It starts out by suggesting that it's not the bureaucrats who are running the administration, not they who are running the structures of ordinary life in Calcutta, but the police who are doing this. And during the working out, the unfolding of this very short kind of fantasy or dream narrative, you have House himself, or the narrator, interviewed for a job under the special branch in the police intelligence service, and trying to show his willingness to be so inducted in a very satirical and comic way. So I think that it is, owing to these differences of opinion with colonial power, and especially with the formal aspects of colonial power, that Humphry House left Presidency and ultimately went back to England.
Would there be? Oops, sorry. No, just come there. Would there be any kind of reflection of Rosario in that case in Presidency? Rosario had the same kind of problems, didn't he?
You mean De Rosio?
Yes.
De Rosio?
Yes.
De Rosio is a long time ago at this point, and De Rosio was actually what is technically described as an Anglo-Indian. That is to say, he was of native origin, whereas Humphry House was very much a visiting Englishman. He was freer in that respect. He was just somebody visiting from abroad and free to go back whenever he wished to. Sajni, what do you think?
Yeah, I don't think there's any similarity really. De Rosio was thrown out of Hindu college or left the antecedent of Presidency College because of a kind of the native establishment that had employed him in the first place, because he was teaching these young boys to eat beef and be irreverent. Yeah, well, irreverence, I think, is something that Derozio and House probably had in common.
Anti-establishment?
And yes, anti-establishment too.
Anyway, no, I do have one. May I? Yes. Well, anyway, so he had a pretty short tenure, both at presidency for whatever reason, and at Ripon. And Ripon perhaps is not that easy to understand as to why he left after 1 year.
I think because he had been called here for an initial time of 2 years, and he went back about the time those 2 years were over. So he didn't go away from Ripon College with any kind of anger or annoyance.
So had he come contracted for a 2-year tenure?
Yes, I think it was meant to be 2 years, so he could officially stay here for 2 years. The contract was with the government from which he resigned, but he stayed on. He taught in Calcutta University, and he traveled a lot all over India, and generally met a lot of people, made a lot of friends, went for long walks in Calcutta, which is why he seems to have known it so well in this book.
I should have a magic touch, not being able to. Anyway, now let's come to the book itself then. Sujaan, why do you think it had to be self-published? Was it self-published because he couldn't find a publisher? But then on the other hand, he had a couple of reviews which were quite good reviews, I think. Must have pleased him greatly. So maybe that wasn't the reason. It's really a longish article, isn't it, rather than a book. And coming to his paranoia, as Isaiah Berlin called it, about being followed and questioned and so on, I wonder whether that was all that unusual, considering that he kept company with Michael Scott and Michael Carrot, who were both obviously informers for the Communist Party, and this suspicion of the Communist Party, of course, has survived well into Indian independence also. You remember that
Absolutely.
Mr. Nehru also had deep misgivings, and the communists were banned in certain parts of India immediately after independence. So why would this have taken him so much by surprise, do you think? That did he resort to self-publication as a means of self-protection?
The publisher the publishing house which brought this out, Bharati Bhavan, it doesn't appear to have left too many records in the archives. I mean, there are only so many references. I mean, we have only found a few books that were brought out by Bharati Bhavan, and it seems very much to be something that belonged to that circle as well. So, 1934 in Porichoy, we find an advertisement for Sudhindranath Datta's orchestra, which is being brought out by Bharati Bhavan. And 1938, we remember Dhurjyoti Prasad reviewing a book on Hindustani classical music, which was published from Bharati Bhavan by one of their friends. So this would probably have been a closed circle publishing house which was sort of working almost as a mouthpiece for the Porichoy group and its peripheral members or integral members as well. But we can only guess at why he would have self-published it. I mean, one reason might be that, as you can see, there's the response that he got from his publisher later, Rupert Hart Davis, who said that pardon me for saying so, but it reads like the work of a brilliant undergraduate. So it, as a standalone text, for its literary merit, I'm not sure whether it would have been appreciable in the same way that we are able to do at a distance, when the political implications of what the text talks about are much clearer in certain ways. And so in that, I think, yes, he probably would have found it difficult to get a publisher. The other reason might be that he knew that his time was short and he had to do it very quickly, and that's probably a pragmatic consideration that may have played into his decision to self-publish it. As for your other question, it certainly should not come as a surprise if you're hanging out with Michael Scott and Michael Carritt that you might come under suspicion. But at the same time, Humphry himself was doing things in a way, with a fairly straight face, as he does in this book as well, which invited suspicion directly on him. Which is to say, for instance, if we're looking at the National Archives and the papers at the National Archives, and we see that All India Radio, the radio broadcasters had singled him out and said that this is someone who's dangerous and someone whose book reviews need to be censored before he is allowed to read them out. Because when he was reviewing books, he would bring in a kind of political commentary that was not acceptable to the censor board. And so it's not just people who he was moving around with, but he himself who was sort of inviting trouble in a certain sense. And so
he wasn't shy about naming names, because he named Imperial Chemicals, and he also named the Deputy Commissioner in the Special Branch. I don't know whether that was a real person or not.
Yes,
but,
yes.
Johnston,
but
yes.
That was pretty close to the bone, I should imagine, if it was a real person.
Yes.
So he did fly fairly close to the wind, didn't he?
Yeah.
Yes.
Would you like to?
Yes, and I think also he was quite taken up with the idea of being thought a spy, and so he had to keep up the pretense. And I think the book must have come out just before he left, so he didn't wait to see the reactions that came out. And some of the papers that Sujaan got on a visit to Rachel Thurley, his daughter, from something called Humphry House's India Box, what it's called in the family. That's one of the places from which we got the reviews. So they must have come out after he left and were sent across by friends. So I think it was sort of one last dig at the British administration just before he left.
I'd like to add to that, if I may. Hanging out with Carritt and Scott at the time in 1937-38 was not in itself a cause for concern, because, of course, Carritt had not been, as it were, exposed as a spy
identified as the
at that time. And if you read Carritt's extraordinarily engaging autobiography, A Mole in the Crown, which was published in the 1980s, a long time afterwards, after he had retired, he left the Indian Civil Service immediately after returning to England, which he did around 1939 or so, just around that time. And after returning to England, he resigned from the Indian Civil Service. And then there was this long, and he immediately publicly became paid up member of the Communist Party of Great Britain, which he had already been, of course. Then there is a long Home Office inquiry into Carritt, which I have seen all the records for at the British Library, in Carritt's file, where basically they're trying to stop his pension. They're trying to stop his pension, and they're trying to look for material against him which will be grounds for stopping his pension, which is £160 a year. And then ultimately they dig up a box, Carritt's India box, from his father's front garden. His father was a fellow of University College, Oxford, and he lived on Boars Hill. And so they dig up a box full of top secret papers, and then there's a big controversy as to who has ownership of those papers, whether they should be sent back to India, as of course they should have been, and whether the Chief Constable of Berkshire County is within his rights to attach these papers. So Carrot and Scott and their involvement in communist politics at the time was not actually known. Rather, as Carrot says in his autobiography, House was suspected of being the Moscow agent, the Moscow spy.
And was totally delighted at the idea.
And Carrot writes in his autobiography that House was absolutely delighted at the idea that he should be considered an agent of the Comintern. And in one of their Sunday morning meetings, he says that, I am now an internationally recognized figure, I am a writer of international renown, the police who are on my trail are an international body, and there is this delightful account in Carrot's autobiography of House then playing up his spydom for all it's worth. And clearly this book is also a set of satirical digs at this culture of surveillance, this atmosphere of constant suspicion that he found in Calcutta in the 1930s, and which he saw as leading towards a spyarchy of the future.
You would disagree with Isaiah Berlin's comment that he
absolutely.
was paranoid.
100 times.
Well, since I'm probably the only person in Calcutta who actually was a student of Isaiah Berlin, I must warn you that I must warn you that he was. Oh my dear, I have intense problems with this. Sorry.
Yeah, I
But he was much given, as you know, to sarcastic comments in his correspondence. He and his close circles rather specialized in these acerbic comments, so I wouldn't take it terribly seriously. But it is interesting that you've quoted him at some length in the foreword. But I'd like to come to Sujaan now. Sujaan, you mentioned Rupert Hart-Davis's rather put-down remark about House, the work of a brilliant undergraduate. I suppose I should be asking you this, Supriya, but anyway, Sujaan, you've mentioned it, so let me ask you. Would you say that was justified?
I don't think it was justified. I mean, clearly we have a certain investment in the text, which is why we have been working on it for several years, well, a few years now. But I do also see where Rupert Hart-Davis is coming from, in the sense that it doesn't seem to have been an easy read for someone who was not familiar with what Humphry was talking about, and which is also what prompted Sajnidhi and me to annotate as densely as we possibly could, because we also felt that the text had a certain opacity, it has a certain mystique about, I don't know if mystique is the right word here, but it has a certain puzzling quality to it, which, I mean, is very easy to sort of miss as a reader if you're not entirely familiar with the context from which House is writing and with what he's talking about. And I personally find it interesting because, I mean, it also sort of goes back to several, I mean, some of the most important modernist texts where you have this peripatetic narrator who sort of goes around the city. But what I also find interesting in House is that there are clues to understanding this within the text. I mean, how you decode this text. I mean, there are certain leading references in it which sort of help you to understand why the images are so randomly juxtaposed. I mean, the reference to Salvador Dali, for instance, is one such. I mean, where you see that there is a certain kind of surrealist aesthetic at work, and Humphry House is quite conscious of that. So,
which Supriya found for us, and then
that's my archival name.
yes, yes.
Editor Supriya, would you have published it?
An editor. Well, I think that, to me, it seems the kind of thing that should have come out in a journal, maybe. You know, it doesn't seem long enough for publication as a book. But we must remember, this is a period, the modernist works are really short. Think of the parallel instance is T.S. Eliot's The Waste Land. Too long to be published as a poem in a collection, too short to be published by itself, and therefore he adds the notes. You remember there's this great story about why T.S. Eliot added notes to The Waste Land, and Sajni and Sujaan have added notes to I Spy. He added notes to The Waste Land because the publisher told him that it was too short. Too short to be published. So it is, elliptic, but it has an extraordinary reach. And the reach is particularly, in my opinion, because it's looking forward to a later period, the period of the Cold War, for example, where spy fiction and spy culture and this culture of surveillance becomes very much the order of the day. And it's as though Humphry House is seeing this, a kind of pre-visioning of it, in interwar Calcutta, pre-war, pre-Second World War Calcutta.
You would agree with that?
Yes, absolutely. I have to say, I read T.S. Eliot. I don't think I've read The Waste Land unless it's been forced on me to teach it with as much joy as I read I Spy with My Little Eye, because it's. But yes, I Spy is equally full of texts. The thing is, whereas in Eliot, these multiple references sometimes seem to be collected at random, though I think Sujaan will jump on me about this. In House, they are very, very carefully chosen. One of the things he used to do, as Supriya said, I think, was broadcast on All India Radio. And he picks the moment, the sedition, picks the appropriate moment for talking about sedition laws at the time when in British history they solidified after a monarch had been murdered and after monarchy was restored. And so he picks that precise moment, gives you this marvelous selection of texts from Milton, who, of course, by then was a canonical writer for people reading English at Oxford or Cambridge or right here in Calcutta. Milton was good for you. But on the other hand, here's Milton preaching sedition and preaching it loudly, And Humphry finds exactly the most perfect quotations from Samson Agonistes, from Paradise Lost, from Paradise Regained even, and from, of course, Areopagitica. And he's the perfect author to cite from in this respect, but very mischievous on Humphrey's part, because of course people will say Milton, and expect you to be reverential without understanding Milton's tremendously revolutionary message.
Also, in the context of the sedition law, he actually mentions 124A of the colonial sedition law. And that is relevant today, isn't it? It is, I think, extremely relevant to this audience at this moment in Indian history, for an author so many decades ago in pre-war Calcutta, citing the sedition law and saying that for quoting and analyzing Milton on public radio, you might be seen as, as guilty of sedition and inciting people to revolution, to revolt.
May I just come in on this for a minute?
Of course, yes.
I'd just like to read.
While you're finding that, can I just go to Sujaan? Sujaan, what I think Rupert Hart Davis would have had problems with, and being kind of playing the devil's advocate a bit, I might have problems with as well, is something that Sajni also mentioned, the numerous quotations, which you've referenced so assiduously. I mean, the quotations, I've just made a note of them. They're quotations from the Bible, from nursery rhymes, from Milton, from Dickens, from Dali. This is a fairly heavy dose for a longish article. And maybe this is what Rupert Hart Davis had in mind when he said the work of a brilliant undergraduate. Would you buy that?
It is certainly very heavy with quotations and references. And, well, I mean, the number of endnotes we have, I mean, is testifies to that. But at the same time, I don't know. I mean, for me, it also feels like Humphry would have enjoyed this as a kind of inside joke with people who were familiar with the similar terrain of English literature and of the visual arts and everything that he really references. But it's what I find remarkable is that it's not just literary references or references to Dali and other visual artists, but it's also an incredible number of references to contemporary events and things that are happening in Kolkata at the time. I mean, for instance,
football matches, for instance.
There are a couple of football matches which he refers to, and then there's this bit where he talks about there's this parody question paper which says, "I can hardly believe my eyes," quote from Berkeley. Comment on this statement as relevant to either events in Strand Road on the evening of the August 14th or the value of photography in detective work. And so it immediately sort of prompts you to ask, I mean, what happened on 14th August at the Strand Road? And so we went up.
Sujaan found that out for us.
And just looking at the Statesman archives, I mean, you see that there was an Andaman's Day which was being observed on the 14th of August, and so there was this large procession that was coming down to the town hall, down the Strand Road, and so they were stopped by the British police, and there was an exchange of words leading to an exchange of blows and so on. And so, I mean, I find it interesting that he has these references from so many different areas of his experience. I mean, it's not just Humphry as a reader of English texts, as an English professor, but also Humphry who's staying in Kolkata, who's very much immersed in the time. And so, while I would agree that it is, yes, I mean, it is very dense, but it's also got all of these things which may have been, which Rupert Hart Davis may have found difficult to appreciate given his geographical and political distance from the moment. So I think that's what I would.
Sajni, you found the reference?
Yeah. Okay. This is section 124 of the Indian Penal Code. The Indian Penal Code having been set up by Macaulay. I think we can. I don't even need to try and say how appalling Macaulay is. Whoever by words spoken or written, or by signs, or by visible representations or otherwise, brings or attempts to bring into hatred or contempt, or excites or attempts to excite disaffection towards His Majesty or the government established by law in India shall be punished. This section of the Penal Code, established by the British, was retained in toto, just leaving the words His Majesty out and making it the government. Okay, and it's been used by every government to get rid of anybody who opposes that particular government. Whenever I read the sedition law, I change that word. His Majesty has already been dropped. I change government to the Constitution of India. And I think we would have many of our political leaders since independence in jail many of the leaders who are in power right now, if this were the law, and the only thing is you can't make a case on behalf of the Constitution.
Supriya, we've sort of dug fairly deep into this work now. In fact, we spent more time on it than it would take to read. But never mind, that's the nature of things. But these good people who've come to listen are people that we obviously want to inspire to buy the book. And we might then request you to tell us what is special about it and why should they spend a bit of time, a bit of money to buy it and to read it.
Thank you. That's a very good question. Well, it's funny, it's entertaining, it captures a certain period in history, in the life of the city, in social history. It is a piece of fiction which has a beginning, a middle, and an end. Its difficulties are compensated for by this extraordinary labor of introduction and notes writing by Sajni Mukerji and Sujaan Mukherjee. And I do think that it is very worthwhile as a way of learning something, as an instrument, as a means of learning something about our own history, the history of our own times, which we do not often know as much about as we should. And I think that this period, the period right before the Second World War and right before Indian independence, is a very critical time in the Indian polity and, of course, in terms of Indian social, cultural, and literary history. It's a period where you find, on the one hand, the struggles, the Indian freedom struggle, proceeding at a much quicker pace with independence very, very much in sight. But at the same time, there is this shadow, the menace of the Second World War hanging over, most of the world, the Nazis, National Socialism, fascism, all kinds of political rifts, and the growth of various kinds of new literary movements, the Progressive Writers Association in North India, the various currents of modernism that you find in Bengal, to some extent in Hindi literature and in Urdu literature, and Urdu and Hindi I would say are covered by the PWA to some extent, but also in Malayalam and in Andhra and Kannada and so on. So I think this is a very, very interesting period, and it's interesting for us now to learn a bit more about it and to learn by what means we came to the state that we now inhabit and how this work is relevant. As I say, it is relevant because of its reflections on the state of surveillance and the sedition law for us today.
I know that you're all very anxious to ask questions, and we've encouraged you to buy the book, so you'll want to know precisely why you should, and that's quite legitimate. But we'll come to that in a moment. I'd like to ask Sajni to comment on a quotation which I will give from the text. And this is a quotation not from the numerous sources that House actually quotes in the text, but his own words. He says, "There is no city in the world where learning is held in higher esteem than in Calcutta, and none where a reputation for it is easier to acquire." Over to you. You have to defend this.
Well, do I need to? Do I have to? You've asked me a very difficult question because I'm part of Calcutta from birth, even without being a Bengali, and I have acquired my basic education here, and all the learning I have. It hasn't always been easy, but it's been good, and I'd rather have acquired it here than anywhere else.
Do you want to say anything on that? Well, is your reputation in danger?
Well, I think that it's absolutely true, but it's also easy to lose a reputation for learning, isn't it? In Calcutta, it's a scene of bitter quarrels about who is actually learned or well-informed and who isn't. And so while it's easy to acquire a reputation, it's also quite easy to lose it, surely, in Calcutta.
So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for your patience. Who would like to ask a question? Someone to break the ice.
Maybe.
Yeah, please. You get about 10 minutes to do something. It's not only me that has the anti-Midas.
This is a question for Sajni, and it's not so much about Humphry's book, but in your work on Dickens, and I was always wondering whether or not Humphry's experience living in Calcutta informed his reading of Dickens.
Well, I'm going to make a slightly, what should I say, smelly moment, bring a smelly analogy in. I had been told by people that he wrote, or he thought this book at any rate, while he was in Calcutta. And so I read it very carefully for, typical Calcutta moments in it. And I found one which stared me in the face, which was that he described the symptom of cholera exactly as doctors do in Calcutta, which is rice water stool. And I don't think this is a description you could get anywhere else in the world except in Bengal. There were other things, like I certainly got the feeling that his comments on Bleak House, from where I had originally written an article about called Telescopic Philanthropy on Dickens. That particular, I had read Bleak House before that, but that particular phrase came to me because Humphry House used it in his description of walking along the Strand Road and seeing the immense exploitation of India via trade that the British had accomplished. And by that stage, of course, even if the company had given up on, officially the East India Company and the British government had given up on stuff like opium, but there was still opium being collected and branded and marketed by British so-called pirates along the Strand Road. And so yes, I think there are little hints right through Dickens' world that it might well have been thought of in Kolkata, but he did write it after he went back. And his niece, Julia Parry, told us the story about how his old lover, Elizabeth Bowen, the novelist, and he were planning to write a book together on Dickens. And when he spoke about Dickens, in the end, Elizabeth Bowen I think very graciously said to him, Humphrey, you have much more interesting ideas about Dickens than I think anybody else in England at the moment. And I think you should write this book by yourself, not have me to collaborate or any other well-known Dickensians. So yes, I think Kolkata played an important part in the writing of Dickens' work. Thank you for asking that question, Deb.
No one else to thank for asking a question? Well, I would like on your behalf anyway to thank the speakers very much indeed, Supriya, Sajni, Sujaan, and for taking us through this very entertaining book, and which has, as Sajni and others have pointed out, has some connection with the present day as well, since the legislation mentioned in the book still subsists and is utilized in much the same way. But apart from that, it has merit because it's a rather unique piece of writing, specific to its time, of course, but still nonetheless very interesting for all that. And in thanking our speakers for making this such an entertaining afternoon, I'd like to thank you also for your patience in coming, and good afternoon.
A huge thank you for all our speakers up on this stage.